The bullet split the morning air like thunder born from a clear sky. On the frozen overlook above Summit Pass, where wind carved the snow into restless white waves that rolled across the guardrail and vanished over the edge of the mountain, a German shepherd ran. His name was Shadow. 5 years old. 80 pounds of lean muscle and battlefield memory packed beneath a black and tan coat dusted with frost. His amber eyes burned with the sharp focus of an animal trained to measure danger the way most creatures measured food or warmth. And strapped to his collar, a small matte black camera, no larger than a man's thumb, blinked steadily in the pale winter light, recording everything the dog could see and everything the men behind him did not want the world to know. Another shot cracked across the mountains. Snow exploded 2 feet to Shadow's left, and the dog shifted direction without breaking stride, powerful legs driving him sideways in a zigzag pattern drilled into his body, not on a practice field with rubber bullets and safety whistles, but in the dust and chaos of a world where mistakes were buried rather than corrected. Above the overlook, hidden behind a cluster of snow-covered pines on the ridge, a man in green digital camouflage watched the scene below with eyes the color of winter steel. His jaw was tight, his breathing was controlled, and his voice, when it came, carried the steady calm of someone who had given commands in far worse places than a frozen mountain pass in Colorado. Run, Shadow. Another gunshot. The screen cut to black. 48 hours earlier. If you are watching this story today, take a moment and drop your city or country in the comments below. Tell me where you are. Because this story was made for people who still believe that loyalty and truth matter in a world that sometimes forgets both. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The mountain town of Pine Hollow, Colorado, rested that afternoon beneath a sky the color of cold iron. A winter sky that promised nothing gentle and delivered exactly what it threatened. Along the high ridges above the valley, a storm had begun gathering with the slow patience of something that knew it could not be stopped, sending the first thin ribbons of wind down through pine-covered slopes, where the smell of frozen resin and distant wood smoke drifted across a landscape that had once been a logging route before time, and silence turned it into something quieter. A place where truckers stopped for fuel, where tourists lost their way in winter, where locals learned to read the mood of the mountains the same way sailors read the sea, because in Pine Hollow, storms never arrived politely. They crept over the peaks and swallowed the road hole, turning the narrow highway across Summit Pass into a white ribbon that could erase a man's tracks in minutes. Along that road, a pickup truck moved slowly through the thickening snow, an old dark green Ford with rust along the wheel wells, and a windshield mapped with hairline cracks from years of gravel roads. The engine hummed low, maintained out of necessity rather than pride, and inside the cab, the heater pushed warm air against the cold, pressing in from every direction, creating a small pocket of warmth that felt borrowed from a world that had no intention of being generous. Behind the wheel sat a man whose stillness carried more weight than the storm building above the mountains. Colton Draper, 39 years old. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the compact, hardened build of someone who had spent years carrying loads both physical and invisible. He wore the green woodland digital camouflage of the United States Navy working uniform Type 3. The long-sleeve blouse and trousers fitted with the kind of neatness that came not from vanity, but from discipline so deeply practiced it had become the only language his body still understood. Brown combat boots rested against the pedals. His face was angular and weathered by sun and wind from places he did not talk about. Steel blue eyes watching the road with the quiet vigilance of a man who still measured doorways before walking through them and counted exits before sitting in any room. A short regulation haircut. An ash-brown beard threaded with early gray, shadowing a jaw that rarely relaxed. He had been driving for 11 hours. Pine Hollow was not his destination. His destination was a small military cemetery in Ridgefield, 20 miles past the valley, where a headstone bearing the name Sawyer Calloway waited beneath winter snow. Sawyer had been an infantryman, 26 years old, the day a rooftop collapsed in a country whose name Colton had trained himself never to say aloud, because the sound of it brought back other sounds that no amount of driving or silence could erase. Sawyer had died beside him, and the last words he spoke with dust in his throat and blood soaking through the fabric beneath Colton's pressing hands formed a sentence so ordinary it had haunted Colton every night for 5 years. Visit Pine Hollow for me. Tell my sister I was not afraid. Colton had promised. He was the kind of man who kept promises the way old churches keep silence. Not because anyone was watching, but because the structure would collapse without it. The storm had closed Summit Pass 2 hours ago. The cemetery would wait until morning. In the passenger seat, Shadow sat with ears angled forward and amber eyes tracking the snowflakes spiraling across the windshield. The German Shepherd was built lean and powerful muscles, shaped by training rather than comfort his thick coat, dark against the worn fabric of the seat. His nose twitched toward the warm air vent, and although his body appeared relaxed, his posture held the readiness of an animal that could reach full alertness before a human could blink. Shadow had once dug Colton out of a collapsed building during a mission overseas. 40 minutes of clawing through dust and broken concrete until his nose found the faint heartbeat of the man who trained him. That memory lived in both of them now, not in words, but in the way Shadow pressed his shoulder against Colton's leg during nightmares, and in the way Colton's hand always found the back of the dog's neck when the world became too loud or too still. 4 years together. They had saved each other more times than counting could capture, and they were all each other had left. The neon sign appeared through the falling snow like a tired yellow promise. Summit Diner. A squat roadside building with fogged windows and a gravel lot half buried in white. 2 trucks sat near the entrance engines still ticking. A patrol car rested at the far end with its lights dark and its windshield slowly vanishing beneath a fresh layer of snow. Colton parked, killed the engine, and sat in the silence. Shadow looked at him, then at the diner, then at him again. "Just coffee," Colton said quietly. "Then we keep moving." He did not know yet that he would not keep moving. He did not know that the woman inside had spent 20 years waiting for someone brave enough to stay. He did not know that the dog beside him was about to become the most important witness in the history of this quiet mountain town. He knew only that the storm was worsening and the dead do not wait forever. Inside, the diner carried the thick comfort of fried bacon and fresh coffee and the metallic hum of an old heater fighting the mountain cold. Truckers talked low near the counter. A jukebox played something old and country, the kind of song that sounded like it had been written at 3 a.m. by someone who had just lost the only person worth cooking for. Behind the counter stood a woman whose presence held the room together the way a single beam holds a ceiling. Mabel Dawson, 62. Silver hair in a practical bun, unchanged for 20 years. Because Mabel believed consistency was a form of honesty. Strong shoulders from decades of carrying trays and keeping a business alive through winters that killed crops and profits in the same week. A face lined with laughter and hardship carved so close together that strangers could not tell which creases came from joy and which from grief. And dark brown eyes sharp enough to read a person the moment they crossed her threshold. Mabel had lost her husband 20 years ago. The official report called it a logging accident on the ridge above town. Mabel had read that report more times than she could count, and she had never once believed a word of it. When the diner door opened and a tall man in camouflage walked in with a German shepherd at his heel, Mabel studied him the way she studied everyone: posture, eyes, the way his hand rested on the dog's shoulder as though the animal were not a pet, but a partner whose position mattered. She set black coffee in front of him at the corner booth without being asked. "You look like you have been driving longer than you should have," she said. Not a question. An observation from a woman who had spent 6 decades learning to tell the difference between a man who was traveling and a man trying to outrun something that could not be outrun. Colton lifted the mug slightly. Mabel looked down at Shadow, who had settled beside the booth with his chin on his paws. Amber eyes half closed, but ears still tracking every sound. She slid a plate of scrambled eggs toward the floor with a small smile. "Every good soldier deserves decent food, whether he walks on 2 legs or 4. Colton murmured that she spoiled the dog too much, but gratitude lived quietly inside the words. Mabel filled a water bowl from a plastic jug of bottled water and set it beside Shadow's plate. "Tap water has been tasting strange lately," she mentioned almost to herself. "Started buying these a few months back, probably nothing. But I do not trust what I cannot explain." She walked away. No one noticed the comment. It was too small, too ordinary, the kind of thing a person says about weather or plumbing that vanishes into background noise. But it would return. And when it did, it would change everything. Near the counter, a young deputy sat with a paper cup going cold. Judson Oakes. Everyone called him Judd. 26. Sandy brown hair beneath a patrol cap. Son of a mechanic and a mother who insisted he become the lawman their town deserved. He had joined the sheriff's department believing he could protect Pine Hollow. But in the past year, he had learned that certain families bent small-town law the way strong wind bends pine branches slowly and quietly, and always in a direction that served only them. Judd glanced toward Colton and Shadow. His eyes lingered on the military posture, the disciplined dog, the way the man scanned the room once before choosing a seat with a clear view of every entrance. Judd recognized what he was seeing. Something tightened in his face before he turned away and pretended to check his phone. For a few quiet minutes, the diner held the fragile rhythm of clinking plates and murmured conversation. The kind of borrowed peace that exists in roadside places where strangers share warmth without asking questions. Then Shadow raised his head, ears forward, nostrils flared. A sound vibrated deep in his chest, not a growl, but something older, the way the ground hums before an earthquake reaches the surface. Colton's hand found the dog's neck. Easy. Shadow's amber eyes locked on the front door. Someone was coming. And the dog already understood what the man beside him had not yet realized. The door swung open with a gust that scattered snowflakes across the tile like fragments of a letter torn before it could be read. Garrett Langford stepped inside first. 30 years old. Tall, broad, in the comfortable way of a man who had never carried anything heavier than privilege. Dark hair slicked back with expensive precision, a tailored winter coat open over a cashmere sweater, a smile that was bright and empty, at the same time the smile of someone who walked into every room expecting it to rearrange itself around him. Behind him came his cousin Derek Langford, younger by a few years, leaner, sharper in temperament, blonde hair styled despite the storm, restless eyes. A smartphone already raised at chest-height camera, half ready as though the world existed primarily to be documented for his amusement. Their laughter filled the diner before they reached a table. Garrett remarked loudly that places like this survived only because people had not learned the modern meaning of profit. Derek added that his family probably owned half the valley anyway. The truckers lowered their eyes. Mabel's jaw tightened behind a professional smile. Shadow's head had lifted fully the moment Garrett passed the corner booth. Ears angled forward, nose twitching toward expensive cologne, mixed with a kind of energy that dogs read long before humans recognize it. Colton's fingers brushed the back of Shadow's neck. Hold. Garrett stopped a few feet from the booth. He studied Shadow the way a man studies property he is deciding whether to keep or discard. That is quite the guard dog, he said. The tone was polite. The weight beneath it was not. Trained and under control, Colton replied, low, even. Garrett glanced at Derek and shrugged. A war dog. People romanticize animals like that. But at the end of the day, they are still just animals. Creatures that follow orders and bark when told. Shadow's ears flattened. A warning rumbled deep in his chest. Then Garrett kicked him. His polished boot swung in a quick, careless arc into Shadow's ribs. The dull thud sent the dog sliding across the tile. A sharp yelp cut through the room like something breaking that could never be repaired. The diner went silent. Shadow recovered instantly. Claws scraped tile. Muscles locked. Amber eyes blazed. Then Colton moved. Garrett's wrist was caught in an iron grip before his brain registered what was happening. Colton rose from the booth in one fluid motion, twisted the arm behind Garrett's back, and drove the man forward against the nearest table. Silverware scattered. Garrett's chest hit wood. Derek stumbled backward. Phone aimed at the ceiling. Colton did not shout, did not strike. He leaned close and spoke with a voice that could freeze a room solid. Kicking a K9 that has survived combat is a mistake most people only make once. Next time, the dog will not wait for my command. Shadow stood rigid beside them, tail stiff. Amber eyes locked on Garrett. Waiting. Garrett stopped struggling and laughed thin and confident. You might want to think about whose hands you're putting on. Pine Hollow protects certain families. And it punishes outsiders who forget their place. Colton released him, stepped back, controlled, calm. Behind the counter, Mabel pressed the button on the security monitor and saved the footage. Her hands trembled. She pressed it anyway. Because she had spent 20 years wondering what might have changed if someone had pressed a button like that the day her husband fell from the ridge. Garrett smoothed his coat and dialed his phone. His voice carried across the room as he described an aggressive outsider and a dangerous animal, his tone measured to suggest he was the victim. 10 minutes later, sirens cut through the blizzard. Sheriff Lyle Granger filled the doorway. Broad. Late 50s, iron gray hair, a thick mustache framing a mouth set in permanent judgment. Eyes that measured every situation, not by truth, but by advantage. He listened to Garrett. He never asked Colton a single question. When Mabel stepped forward to say she saw the dog kicked first, Granger raised a hand and smiled the way a man smiles when he wants a woman to understand that her voice does not matter in this room. Ma'am, we will review things later. For now, focus on your business. He paused. Those permits and safety inspections will probably need updating soon. The threat settled over Mabel like a second winter. Granger turned to Colton. Step outside. Assault charges are serious in this county. Handcuffs clicked around Colton's wrists. The sound echoed through the diner louder than any gunshot. Shadow barked once, sharp and desperate, lunging forward before Colton's voice stopped him mid-stride. "Easy, Shadow." 2 words. And the dog froze. Because the bond between them was built not on obedience, but on trust so deep it functioned like gravity, invisible and absolute. Deputy Paxton Holt, nervous and young, took Shadow's collar with visible caution. Animal control would collect the dog for evaluation. "Dangerous animals get quarantined," Granger said flatly. The story had been rewritten before anyone could object. Colton was led to the patrol car. Shadow was loaded into a separate vehicle. Snow fell harder. The neon sign of Summit Diner buzzed and flickered against the darkening sky. Judd Oakes stood near the counter. He had watched everything. His hands gripped the edge of the bar until his knuckles went white. He said nothing, but for the first time since joining the department, he understood that silence was not neutrality. Silence was a choice. And he had just watched the wrong side win because every person in the room, including himself, had chosen it. The next morning, Colton walked out of the sheriff's station into air that smelled of frozen pine and diesel. Cuffs removed, charges dropped. Granger stood behind him in the doorway and explained with a tone designed to sound generous that the matter would not be pursued, provided Colton left Pine Hollow before things grew complicated. "You are free to go, but the dog stays in custody until the evaluation is done. I suggest you do not make trouble." Colton said nothing. He stepped onto the sidewalk and looked down the quiet street where snowbanks leaned against storefronts and trucks crawled through the white morning. The town appeared calm, peaceful even. The way towns always appear in the brief stillness between the first lie and the moment someone decides to tell the truth. Granger believed the warning would push the outsider away. He had misjudged one thing. Colton Draper had left a partner behind once before. In a collapsing building filled with dust and screaming and the sound of a young soldier saying the name of his hometown with his final breath. Colton had survived that day. Sawyer had not. And the guilt of it had lived inside Colton's chest for 5 years, like a second heartbeat, one that never let him sleep through the night and never let him forgive himself for walking out of the rubble while someone who deserved to live did not. Shadow was still out there, locked in a cage somewhere in this town, alone. And Colton Draper did not leave partners behind. Not anymore. He walked toward his truck, boots on packed snow, shoulders moving beneath the camouflage he had never replaced with civilian clothes because the uniform had stopped being about regulations years ago and had become something closer to a reminder of every person he had failed to save and every promise he still owed the dead. He climbed into the cab and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The passenger seat was empty. The impression where Shadow had rested during 11 hours of driving was still pressed into the worn fabric, and a few dark hairs clung to the headrest where the dog had leaned his shoulder against the seat. Colton placed his hand on the empty seat. He held it there for a long time. Then he started the engine. He would not leave Pine Hollow. He would find Shadow. And whatever this town was hiding beneath its clean snow and quiet streets and polite smiles that carried threats instead of warmth, he would find that too. Because the storm above the mountains had not ended. It was only beginning. The Pine Hollow Mountain Rescue Shelter occupied a low hill above the frozen river on the eastern edge of town. A modest building of weathered timber and chain-link fencing that looked as though it had been constructed by people who understood that function mattered more than appearance, and that animals did not care whether the walls were painted. Snow had drifted against the outer gates during the night, forming white banks that reached halfway up the fence posts, and the tin roof sagged slightly under the accumulated weight of a winter that showed no sign of releasing its grip on the valley. Colton Draper stood outside the gate at 9:17 in the morning, his breath forming small clouds that the wind tore apart before they could rise above his shoulders. He had not slept. The cabin he had rented on the edge of town had offered a bed and a heater and 4 walls that kept the storm outside, but none of those things could keep the silence inside from pressing against him the way deep water presses against a diver who has gone too far down. Shadow was not beside him, and the absence occupied a space that was almost physical, a missing weight against his left leg, where the dog had walked for 4 years, through airports and base corridors and dirt roads in countries whose names tasted like dust when he spoke them. The shelter door opened and a young woman stepped out, carrying a metal bucket in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. Her name was Wren Calloway, 27 years old. Chestnut brown hair pulled back loosely beneath a knitted wool cap. A green rescue jacket with the faded patch of the Pine Hollow mountain shelter stitched across the left shoulder. Freckles scattered across a face that carried the kind of seriousness that comes not from personality, but from proximity to grief. The particular gravity that settles into the features of someone who lost a person they loved. At an age when loss was supposed to be something that happened to other families. 5 years earlier, Wren's older brother Sawyer Calloway had been killed during a military operation overseas. He was 26, an infantryman who wrote letters home every 2 weeks, letters that never described the danger but always described the dogs, the strays that followed patrols, the puppies that slept against his boots in the barracks, the old hound with 3 legs that waited outside the mess hall every morning as though keeping a schedule mattered even in a war zone. Sawyer believed that how a person treated animals revealed the architecture of their soul, and he had written that sentence in his final letter home, the one that arrived 11 days after his folded flag. The day the flag came, Wren made a decision that redirected the rest of her life. If the world could take her brother, she would spend whatever years she had protecting the creatures he cared about most. The shelter became her home. The dogs became her purpose. And the quiet routine of feeding and cleaning and healing became the rhythm that kept her upright on mornings when gravity felt personal. She stopped when she saw Colton standing at the gate. She studied him the way people in mountain towns study strangers, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the distance between a visitor and a threat is often measured in intentions rather than miles. "You are the one from the diner," she said, not a question. "My dog is here," Colton replied. "His name is Shadow." Wren looked at his face, at the lines carved by wind and years of sleeping in places where comfort was a concept rather than a reality. At the steel blue eyes that watched her with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that rushing people produced worse results than waiting. "I know which one he is," she said. "Come with me." She led him through the gate and down the narrow path between snowbanks to the kennel building. Inside, the air was warmer, but carried the close smell of animals and concrete and the faint chemical sharpness of disinfectant. Dogs barked from several cages as they passed, their voices echoing off the walls in a chorus that Wren navigated without flinching her boots, leaving damp prints on the floor as she walked toward the back of the row. Shadow was in the third kennel from the rear wall. The German Shepherd was lying on the concrete floor with his body curled, but his head raised, amber eyes lifting the moment the footsteps approached. His ears rotated forward. His nostrils flared once, catching a scent that traveled through the cold air of the kennel like an electrical signal through a wire. Then his tail moved. One slow sweep across the concrete, then another faster. He rose to his feet and pressed his nose against the kennel gate. Colton crouched in front of the wire and extended his hand. Shadow pushed his muzzle through the gap and pressed it against Colton's palm, and the sound that came from the dog's throat was not a bark or a whine, but something between the two, a vocalization that carried recognition and relief, and the particular language that exists only between a handler and a dog who have pulled each other out of darkness more than once. Colton's other hand found the back of Shadow's neck through the wire. His fingers pressed against the thick fur, finding the familiar ridge of muscle along the dog's spine, and for a moment neither of them moved. The soldier and the dog, connected through metal wire by the memory of rubble and dust and the sound of digging that had meant the difference between dying alone and being found. Wren watched from several feet away. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not from cold, but from the pressure building inside her ribcage, as she observed something she had only heard described in Sawyer's letters, the bond between a military handler and a combat K-9 that operated below the level of language in a territory where trust was measured in heartbeats rather than words. She had noticed the tag on Shadow's collar the previous night, U.S. Navy K-9 Division. The words had made her hands tremble because they belonged to the same world that had swallowed her brother whole and returned only a flag and a box of personal effects that included 7 unsent letters and a photograph of a puppy sleeping on a pair of military boots. "He is not injured from the kick," Wren said quietly. "I checked him last night. Bruised ribs on the left side, but nothing broken. He ate a little this morning." Colton nodded without turning away from Shadow. "Thank you for taking care of him." The words were simple, but the weight inside them was not. And Wren heard the difference, because she had spent 5 years listening for the things people meant beneath the things they said. For several minutes, the kennel was quiet. Colton sat on the concrete floor beside the gate with his back against the wall, one hand resting against Shadow's muzzle through the wire, and the German shepherd settled into a position that mirrored his handler's stillness, chin resting on the concrete near Colton's fingers, amber eyes half closed in the first moment of genuine calm the dog had experienced since being taken from the diner. Then the sound of a truck engine broke the peace. Wren straightened. Through the frosted window at the end of the kennel row, headlights cut through the morning snow, a vehicle pulling into the parking area with a weight and speed that did not match the careful approach of county vehicles or delivery trucks. It was a gray transport truck, old, no visible front plates. A temporary tag taped inside the windshield at an angle that suggested the person who placed it did not expect anyone to look closely. The paint was dull and scratched in the particular way of vehicles that spend their working lives in places where accountability is not a priority. 2 men climbed out. The first was thin, early 40s, carrying a clipboard beneath his arm. Frank Wilder. His face carried the permanent fatigue of someone who had spent years following instructions without asking where they led. His badge read, County Animal Health Inspection. And although his voice was polite when he approached the shelter entrance, his eyes slid away from Wren's the way water slides off a surface that has been treated to repel it. "Here for the shepherd," he said. "The evaluation is not finished," Wren replied. "Special order." He flipped a page on the clipboard. Behind him stood the second man, leaning against the truck with a lit cigarette between thick fingers. Brock Slade, 35, shaved head, broad chest stretching a dark jacket tight across shoulders, built for labor rather than conversation. His posture carried the relaxed confidence of someone who expected compliance and had the physical presence to enforce it when compliance was not offered voluntarily. Wren noticed the tattoo, a coiled snake running along the inside of his right wrist, the ink dark and detailed. She had seen that design before on the arms of men who drove Langford construction trucks through town, the work crews that cleared land and dug foundations for development projects that had been spreading through the valley for 3 years, like roots searching for water beneath someone else's garden. "Where are you taking him?" Wren asked. "Quarantine facility down the valley." Wren knew the valley. She had driven every road in it during 5 years of rescue calls and animal transport runs. There was no quarantine facility in the valley. The nearest one operated out of Ridgefield, run by the state, staffed by veterinarians with actual credentials and access through a process that involved paperwork filed weeks in advance, rather than men in unmarked trucks arriving before the morning coffee had cooled. "I will need to see authorization paperwork," she said. Wilder's eyes flickered toward Slade. The larger man exhaled smoke into the cold air and pushed himself off the truck with the slow deliberation of someone adjusting the level of pressure in a room. "The paperwork is in process," Wilder said. "We have verbal authorization from the sheriff's office." Wren held his gaze. "Verbal authorization does not transfer custody of an animal in my facility. I need a signed order." For a moment, the parking lot was silent except for the wind and the faint ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Then Slade spoke for the first time. His voice was low and unhurried. "We can come back with the sheriff if you prefer, but that tends to make things more complicated for everyone." The threat was delivered with the casual precision of someone who had used the same sentence before and knew exactly how much weight it carried in a town where the sheriff's signature could open doors and close businesses with equal ease. Wren did not blink, but her hand moved to her pocket where her phone rested against her thigh. "Give me 10 minutes to prepare the transfer documents," she said. Wilder nodded. He and Slade walked back toward the truck to retrieve a transport crate from the bed, their boots crunching through the snow with the unhurried patience of men who believed the outcome was already decided. Wren stepped inside the office and closed the door. Her fingers found the shelter intake paperwork filed under Shadow's record. The emergency contact number written in neat, controlled handwriting. The phone rang twice. Colton Draper. Wren spoke quickly and quietly, her eyes on the window where Slade's shadow moved across the parking lot. "You need to get here. Right now. They are taking Shadow, and I do not believe they are taking him anywhere safe." A pause on the other end that lasted less than a second. "I am already in my truck. 8 minutes." But 8 minutes was 4 minutes too many. By the time Colton's pickup slid into the shelter parking lot with snow spraying from beneath the tires, the gray truck was gone. The gate stood open. Shadow's kennel was empty. A water bowl lay overturned on the concrete, and a single tuft of dark fur clung to the wire of the gate where the dog had been pulled through with more urgency than care. Wren was standing outside the entrance with her arms tight against her body, and her jaw set in the expression of someone who had just watched a wrong thing happen and been unable to prevent it. "North," she said, before Colton could ask. "Toward the old lumber yard, partial plate number, and the heavy one has a snake tattoo on his right wrist. Langford Construction." Colton's hands gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles whitened, but his voice remained level. "Get in." Wren walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and climbed in without hesitation. They could not pursue now. Daylight made a chase visible, and whoever had taken Shadow would be watching for pursuit. The road north offered no cover for miles, and 2 people in a civilian truck against men who operated under the protection of money and local law enforcement was not a rescue operation. It was a way to get arrested again, or worse. The extraction would have to wait for darkness. That afternoon, in a corner suite of the Pine Hollow Lodge, converted into a temporary office with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making every room serve his purposes, Garrett Langford leaned back in a leather chair and studied the architectural renderings spread across his desk with the focused satisfaction of a man reviewing the blueprint of a future he had already purchased. The room was warm and quiet, insulated from the storm by heavy curtains and thick walls, and the particular kind of silence that money creates around itself, the silence of a space where nothing enters without permission. A desk lamp cast amber light across the papers, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint chemical sweetness of dry, cleaned wool. Across from him sat Nolan Kemp, thin, 35, round glasses sliding down a narrow nose, dark hair combed neatly, the posture of a man perched on the edge of his chair the way a small bird perches on a wire ready to fly in any direction depending on which way the wind pushed. His laptop was balanced on his knees and his fingers moved across the keyboard with the nervous speed of someone who understood that the numbers he managed existed in a territory that could transition from gray to criminal if examined by the wrong people. 3 more parcels along the river road before spring. Garrett said, turning a pen between his fingers with the precision of someone who found pleasure in the mechanics of control. County assessor is on board. Paperwork filed before the state review cycle in April. Nolan nodded without looking up. And keep the environmental report contained. Garrett added his voice, lowering into a register that transformed the instruction into something closer to a threat. No copies outside the primary server. No distribution until the land contracts are... The office door opened. Derek walked in carrying a takeaway coffee cup and the kinetic energy of someone who had been pacing a hallway, waiting for permission to enter a room he believed he had the right to enter without asking. Garrett stopped. The sentence about the environmental report hung unfinished in the air like a door left half open, revealing enough of what lay behind it to make the silence afterward feel heavier than the words themselves. Truck left for the shelter 20 minutes ago. Derek reported, dropping into a chair. Wilder and Slade know what to do. Good. And the soldier... Granger released him this morning. He will be gone by tonight. Derek smirked. And if he stays... Garrett looked at his cousin with the patience of someone who had never been surprised by the outcome of any situation because he had always controlled the variables before the situation began. Then we adjust the variables. He picked up his phone. The call lasted 9 seconds. Brock, tonight. The dog disappears. No traces. He set the phone down and returned to the architectural plans as though the sentence he had just spoken carried no more moral weight than an order for office supplies. Meanwhile, at the cabin on the edge of town, Colton and Wren waited for dark. The hours moved slowly, heavy with the particular tension of people preparing for something dangerous while having nothing to do except sit with the weight of what was coming. Mabel Dawson arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, carrying a covered pot of venison stew and a paper bag of bread rolls, and the instinctive understanding that people preparing to do hard things needed to eat first. She set the food on the small kitchen table and sat down across from Colton and Wren and spoke about Pine Hollow with the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had watched her town change the way a person watches a river slowly erode the bank beneath their house, too gradual to trigger alarm but too constant to ignore. The Langford family had arrived 3 years earlier. Garrett's father started the investment group. Garrett expanded it with a calculated ambition his father never possessed, purchasing land along the Valley Road, funding construction projects that employed enough locals to create dependency and building a relationship with Sheriff Granger that converted law enforcement from a public service into a private instrument. Lyle Granger was a decent man once, Mabel said, stirring her coffee. He came to Harold's funeral, said he was sorry. I think he meant it then." She paused. The fire in the small stove shifted, sending a wave of orange light across the table. Harold died on the ridge above town. They called it a logging accident. A cable snapped. But Harold had been talking publicly about opposing the expansion of logging rights that an investment group was pushing through the county board. She looked at her hands. That was 20 years ago. The investment group became Langford Development, and I have spent every one of those 20 years wondering whether the cable snapped on its own or whether someone cut it. Silence, wind against the cabin walls. "I could never prove it," she said, "and eventually I stopped trying, but I never stopped knowing. And there is a difference between accepting something and believing it." Across town, Judd Oakes sat at his desk in the sheriff's station, scrolling through the digital incident log. What he found made his throat tighten. The report from the diner had been altered. The original entry described an altercation initiated by a civilian complaint. The current version described an unprovoked assault by a transient with a dangerous animal. Mabel Dawson's witness statement had been removed entirely. The edit metadata showed the changes had been made at 6:14 that morning from Sheriff Granger's credentials. Judd took 3 photographs with his personal phone, angling the screen beneath the desk. He saved them in a folder he did not name. Then he sat very still and thought about his mother who needed his income, and his father whose knees would not allow him under cars anymore. And the badge on his chest that was supposed to represent something that the man in the office down the hall had decided it did not. Night fell over Pine Hollow the way winter nights fall in mountain valleys, not gradually, but with the sudden completeness of a curtain being drawn across a window. The last gray light draining from the sky as though someone had pulled a plug and allowed the darkness to flood in from every direction at once. The storm had rebuilt itself above the ridges. Wind drove snow against the cabin in horizontal sheets that hissed against the window panes, and the temperature outside dropped to a level that turned the moisture in a person's breath into crystals before it traveled 6 inches from their lips. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low in the iron stove. Colton sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the back room with the door open, his hands resting on his knees, palms down, fingers slightly spread. The posture of a man trying to hold himself still while something inside him moved in directions he could not control. The flashback arrived the way they always did, without invitation, without warning, without the courtesy of building gradually enough for him to prepare. Dust, the rooftop. A city he no longer named. Shadow barking somewhere below the sound, sharp and frantic, in a way Colton had never heard before the bark of a dog who knows his handler is buried and cannot find the scent through concrete and ash. The wall coming down. The sound of it, a roar that was not like thunder because thunder ends, but this sound folded into itself and kept going the way pain folds into itself when there is too much of it for the body to process in sequence. And Sawyer Calloway on the floor beside him, 26 years old. Dust in his throat. Blood spreading beneath his body in a pool that caught the light from the broken ceiling where the sky was impossibly blue, offensively blue. The kind of blue that had no right to exist above a room where a young man was dying. Colton had pulled Sawyer into the corner, had pressed his hands against the wounds hard enough to feel the pulse beneath his palms, weakening the way a drum beat weakens when the drummer's arms begin to fail. Had called for a medic on a radio that answered with nothing but the sound of static, which is the sound the universe makes when it has decided that help is not coming. Sawyer looked up at him. His eyes were losing focus the way a lantern dims when the oil runs low. The flame, still present, but retreating into itself. "Visit Pine Hollow for me." Colton leaned closer. "Tell my sister I was not afraid." Colton said yes, and then the light in Sawyer's eyes went out. Quietly, without drama. The way a candle goes out when the wax has been used and there is nothing left to burn. Shadow found Colton 40 minutes later, dug through rubble with paws that bled, barked until his voice was raw, pressed his body against the broken concrete, and pushed and clawed and refused to stop until the stone shifted enough for Colton to breathe. The dog saved the man, but the man beside him was already gone. Colton's hands were shaking now in the cabin 5 years and 8,000 miles from that rooftop. The tremor was not visible to anyone who was not looking for it, but it moved through his fingers and into his forearms with the insistence of a memory that refused to become a memory and insisted instead on remaining an experience repeating itself with the full sensory detail of the original moment every time the silence lasted long enough for it to find an opening. A knock at the cabin door. Wren stood on the porch with snow on her shoulders and a thermos in her hands. She had walked from the shelter through the storm 20 minutes on foot because some distances need to be crossed slowly to mean what they are supposed to mean. Colton opened the door. Wren entered without waiting for an invitation, because she could see in his face that the invitation was unnecessary, that he needed someone in the room the way a drowning man needs something solid to hold, even if he does not have the words to ask for it. She poured coffee, set a cup in front of him, sat across the table. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the walls. Sawyer wrote letters every 2 weeks. Wren said after the silence had lasted long enough to become comfortable rather than awkward. He never talked about danger. He talked about dogs, the strays that followed patrols, the puppy that slept on his boots. He said the hardest part of being a soldier was knowing that when you left a place, the animals you had named would have nobody again. She wrapped both hands around her cup. His last letter said something I have never been able to forget. He wrote that he had a buddy in his unit, someone he trusted completely, and that this buddy owed him a visit to Pine Hollow someday. She looked at Colton. He never wrote the name, just a buddy who owed him a visit. Colton stared at the table. The fire shadows moved across his face like the ghosts of sentences he had not yet spoken. The cabin door opened again. Mabel stepped inside, snow-dusting her silver hair, carrying a wool blanket over one arm. She set it on a chair and sat down at the table as though she had been expected, which in a sense she had, because Mabel Dawson had spent 62 years arriving in rooms where she was needed without being asked. 3 people around a table. A widow who had been silent for 20 years. A sister who had been grieving for 5. A soldier who had been running from a promise for just as long. Mabel spoke about Harold again. About the years of running the diner alone, learning to fix every pipe and shingle and fuse because there was nobody else. About the guilt of choosing silence over truth because the truth had no one strong enough to carry it. I told myself I made peace with it, she said quietly. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is just the absence of noise, and there is a difference. Wren talked about the day the flag arrived, about standing on the porch and watching 2 uniformed men walk up the driveway and knowing before they reached the door what they were going to say. About the sound her mother made, a sound that came from a place inside the human body that Wren did not know existed until that moment and hoped to never visit again. And then the cabin was quiet and the fire burned low and Colton spoke. Sawyer was my teammate. The words came out the way a stone comes out of a hand that has been clenched around it for so long that the fingers have forgotten how to open. Slowly, with effort, and with the knowledge that once released, the stone cannot be picked up again. I was beside him when the wall came down. I pulled him into the corner. I held pressure on his wounds. I called for help on a radio that gave me nothing but static. He looked at the fire. He told me to visit Pine Hollow, to find his sister, to tell her he was not afraid. He looked at Wren. It took me 5 years, I'm sorry. Wren did not move for a long time. Her hands stayed around the coffee cup. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw held firm, the Callaway jaw, the same stubborn set that appeared in every photograph of Sawyer that she kept beside her bed. He was not afraid, she said. The words were not a question. They were a confirmation of something she had needed to hear spoken aloud by someone who had been in the room when it mattered. Because written words in a letter are one thing, but a living voice saying the same words while looking into your eyes is something else entirely. Something that can reach the place where grief lives and loosen the hold it has on the walls it has built around itself. Colton nodded. He was not afraid. He talked about you, about Pine Hollow, about the dogs. Wren closed her eyes. A single tear moved down her cheek and fell onto the table without sound. Mabel reached across and placed her hand over Wren's. Outside the cabin, the storm howled. Snow buried the road and the fences and the mailboxes and every other marker that told people where they were in the world. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the edge of town, in an abandoned lumber yard where broken fencing leaned against piles of rotting timber and a long warehouse crouched in the clearing like a sleeping predator, Shadow lay inside a metal cage with a nylon muzzle strapped across his jaws. His powerful body was thinner from a day without proper food. A thick chain connected the cage to a support beam. The air smelled of rust and old sawdust, and the cigarette smoke drifting from the folding table where two men sat waiting for a phone call that would tell them what to do with the dog. But Shadow's amber eyes were open. His ears tracked every sound, cataloging the rhythm of his captors, the way he had once cataloged the rhythms of enemies in buildings and alleyways and compounds on the other side of the world. He was not panicked. He was not defeated. He was waiting. Because waiting was what Shadow did best. He had waited beneath rubble for 40 minutes, once digging and pushing and refusing to stop, and the man he waited for had survived because of it. That man was out there somewhere in the storm, and Shadow would wait as long as it took. The fire in the cabin died to embers. Mabel pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Colton stood and walked to the window where the storm pressed white against the glass. "We go tonight," he said. Wren nodded. Mabel looked at both of them with the expression of a woman who understood that what was about to happen was dangerous and possibly illegal and absolutely necessary. "Then eat something first," she said. She pushed the last of the bread toward Colton, and he took it because he had learned long ago that the women who feed you before you walk into darkness are the ones who believe you are coming back, and sometimes believing is enough to make it true. The road north of Pine Hollow disappeared into darkness, the way secrets disappear into small towns gradually at first, and then all at once, until there was nothing left to follow except instinct and the faint impression of tire tracks filling with fresh snow. Colton drove with the headlights dimmed to parking lamps, guiding the old pickup along the narrow logging road by memory of terrain rather than sight. He had studied the route on a gas station map pinned to the wall of the cabin before they left, tracing the road with his finger, the way he once traced patrol routes on laminated tactical maps in briefing rooms where every line represented a place someone might not come back from. The road curved northwest along the base of the ridge before dropping into the valley where the old Langford lumber yard sat abandoned among dead timber and broken fencing. A property purchased 3 years ago and left to rot because its value to the Langford family had nothing to do with lumber and everything to do with owning a piece of land that nobody visited and nobody questioned. Beside him, Wren sat rigid in the passenger seat. One hand gripped the dashboard. The other held the folded shelter clipboard that still contained Shadow's intake paperwork, the pages trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the cold air leaking through the truck's aging door seals. Her breathing was steady but shallow, the breathing of someone who had spent years rescuing injured animals in mountain terrain, but had never before followed a vehicle into darkness, carrying something that felt less like a rescue and more like the kind of operation her brother used to describe in letters he was not supposed to write. The storm had rebuilt itself above the ridges with the patient cruelty of weather that understands it has all night. Snow fell in thick curtains that blurred the tree line into a continuous wall of white and black, the pines appearing and disappearing through the windshield like figures standing at the edge of a stage, waiting for their scene to begin. "Half a mile," Colton said quietly. He killed the engine and let the truck coast to a stop beside a snowbank where a stand of dead aspens provided cover from the road ahead. The silence that followed the engine's death was immediate and complete, the kind of silence that exists only in mountain wilderness during heavy snowfall when every sound is absorbed by the white accumulation before it can travel more than a few yards. They stepped out into the cold. Colton closed the driver's door with his hip rather than his hand, a habit learned in places where the sound of a closing door could carry farther than a gunshot, and moved to the front of the truck where he paused to study the terrain ahead. The lumber yard materialized through the snow like the skeleton of something that had died standing up. Rows of broken fencing leaned at angles that suggested surrender rather than damage. Piles of rotting timber lay scattered across the clearing in dark heaps that the snow had softened into mounds resembling shallow graves. And in the center of the property, a long warehouse building crouched low against the ground, its corrugated walls streaked with rust and fire damage from the blaze that had ended its operational life several winters earlier. No lights burned inside the building, but through the falling snow, the faint glow of headlights appeared briefly behind the far wall, before disappearing, the telltale sign of a vehicle parked with its engine running and its lights cycling on and off as someone inside checked their phone or adjusted the heater. "They are here," Colton murmured. Wren moved beside him, her boots crunching softly through the thin crust of snow that had formed over the deeper powder beneath. She pulled her coat tighter and studied the warehouse with the practical assessment of someone who had entered enough damaged structures during animal rescues to recognize which walls could support weight and which ones were waiting for an excuse to collapse. "Side window," she whispered, pointing toward a section of the warehouse where a pane of glass had shattered outward, leaving a dark opening framed by jagged edges that reflected the snow in small, sharp points of light. They crossed the clearing slowly, keeping low behind stacks of old timber beams that provided cover between the tree line and the warehouse wall. The snow fell harder with each minute, which was both a danger and a gift, because heavy snowfall reduced visibility for everyone, including the men inside. When they reached the window, Colton pressed his back against the wall and leaned sideways to look through the broken glass. The interior of the warehouse was lit by a single portable lantern set on a wooden crate, its yellow light creating a circle of visibility that faded into darkness at the edges like a small island of warmth surrounded by cold black water. Shadows climbed the walls and shifted with every flicker of the flame. Shadow was there. The German shepherd stood inside a metal cage pushed against the far wall, his powerful body thinner than it should have been after a day without adequate food, but still unmistakably strong beneath the dark fur. A thick nylon muzzle had been strapped across his jaws, and a chain connected the cage to a rusted support beam. But his amber eyes burned with the sharp focus of a trained K9 who had not surrendered to his circumstances despite the unfamiliar place and the unfamiliar hands that had put him there. His ears lifted the instant the faint shift of snow outside the window reached him. A tremor passed through his body, the visible effort of a disciplined animal restraining himself from barking when every instinct demanded it. He knew. Two men sat near a folding table covered with paperwork and empty coffee cups. Brock Slade leaned back in a metal chair with his thick arms crossed, scrolling through his phone with the bored impatience of someone waiting for instructions rather than making decisions. The coiled snake tattoo on his wrist caught the lantern light each time he shifted position. Across from him sat Nolan Kemp, hunched over a laptop that glowed faintly in the yellow light. The accountant's round glasses reflected the screen as his fingers tapped the keyboard with the nervous rhythm of a man who understood that the documents he managed were not the kind that survived audits, and that being inside this warehouse at this hour placed him on the wrong side of a line he had been carefully straddling for 3 years. They said the dog disappears tonight. Nolan muttered, his voice thin with the particular anxiety of someone who had agreed to do something he did not fully understand, and was beginning to realize that not understanding was not the same as not being responsible. Brock shrugged without looking up from his phone. Orders from Garrett. The name settled into the warehouse like a stone dropping into still water. Colton had heard enough. He turned to Wren and spoke with the controlled clarity of someone shifting from observation to action, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the precise authority of a man who had briefed teams before operations in buildings far more dangerous than this one. When I open the door, go straight to the cage. Get the muzzle off him first, then the lock. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a small pair of bolt cutters that Wren recognized from the shelter's toolkit, the ones she kept mounted on the wall beside the intake desk for cutting wire and chain link during emergency extractions of trapped animals. He had taken them from her truck before they left. Wren took the bolt cutters and nodded. Colton moved to the warehouse door. What happened next took less than 12 seconds. The door burst inward with a crack of splintering wood that shattered the silence like a rifle shot. Colton crossed the distance to Brock's chair in 3 strides, seized the larger man's arm before he could stand fully, and twisted it behind his back with the mechanical precision of a close-quarters technique practiced 10,000 times until the motion lived in muscle rather than thought. Brock's face struck the folding table. The lantern rocked wildly, sending shadows lurching across the walls like startled animals. Coffee cups scattered across the floor. Nolan Kemp froze beside the laptop. His glasses slipped down his nose. His mouth opened, but no sound came out because the gap between the quiet accounting work he performed for wealthy clients and the reality of a military-trained man disabling his colleague 3 feet away was a distance his nervous system had not been designed to cross. Wren ran past both of them. Shadow's tail struck the cage bars once when he heard Colton's voice. The German shepherd remained disciplined even in that surge of recognition, holding position inside the cage as Wren knelt beside the door and fitted the bolt cutters against the padlock. The metal resisted for 1 second, then 2, and then the lock snapped open with a sound that was small but carried the weight of something much larger being set free. She pulled the cage door wide and reached for the muzzle. The nylon straps were tight fastened by hands that did not care about the animal's comfort, and Wren's fingers worked quickly, finding the buckle beneath Shadow's jaw and releasing it with a motion that was both gentle and urgent, the motion of someone who understood that every second a creature spends restrained is a second that costs something invisible but real. The muzzle fell away. Shadow inhaled deeply. One long breath drawn through an open mouth for the first time in hours, filling his lungs with air that tasted like freedom, even though it also tasted like rust and sawdust and the lingering smoke of a fire that had burned years ago. Then he stepped out of the cage and stood beside Colton. The bond required no words, no commands, no signals. The dog aligned himself with his handler's posture the way a compass needle aligns with north, finding the orientation that had been programmed into every fiber of his training and reinforced by every moment of shared survival. But Colton's eyes had moved to the laptop. Nolan Kemp had not closed it. The screen still glowed, and in the scramble of the previous 12 seconds, the accountant had not thought to protect the information displayed on it because his mind was occupied with the more immediate concern of whether the man who had just pinned Brock Slade to a table was going to do the same to him. Colton leaned over the keyboard. Emails, dozens of them. Correspondence between Garrett Langford and Sheriff Lyle Granger spanning 18 months discussing payment schedules, permit approvals, and the strategic management of what one email called community resistance factors. A spreadsheet tracking monthly transfers from Langford Development to an account registered under the name of a company that did not appear to exist outside of the document itself, and a file. The file name read water_quality_report_confidential.pdf. Colton pulled Wren's phone from his pocket, the one she had given him in the truck, and photographed the screen. 4 shots, emails, spreadsheet, the file name, and the first page of the report itself, which contained enough technical data to make the color drain from the face of anyone who understood what the numbers meant. "Time to go," he said. They disappeared into the storm. Behind them, Brock struggled upright, swearing into the cold air. Nolan Kemp stared at the open warehouse door with the expression of a man watching the first crack appear in a dam he had helped build, knowing that what came through it would wash away everything on the other side. The call came 30 minutes later. Garrett Langford answered on the second ring, standing beside the window of his hotel suite, where the storm pressed snow against the glass like white hands trying to find a way inside. Brock's voice was rough and furious. The soldier was here. He took the dog, and he saw the laptop. The silence on Garrett's end lasted 4 seconds. In a man who controlled every variable in his life with the precision of a chess player who had never lost a game, 4 seconds of silence was the equivalent of a scream. "What was on the screen?" he said quietly. "Everything." Kemp had the accounts open, and the water report. Garrett closed his eyes. When he opened them, the calculation behind them had already completed. The anger that a lesser man would have expressed had been processed, converted, and redirected into action before it reached his face. "The diner," he said. "Tonight. What about it?" "Burn it. The old woman has been talking too much. The cameras in that building recorded everything from the incident with the dog. Destroy the building and every piece of evidence inside it." "Garrett the sheriff." "The sheriff will be told it was an electrical fire caused by the storm. He will believe it because he is paid to believe what I tell him to believe. Do it now." The call ended. 2 hours later, Summit Diner burned. The fire began in the stack of firewood piled against the exterior wall near the kitchen, a location chosen because it would appear accidental to anyone who did not look closely, and because the dry timber would catch quickly in the cold air, where the wind carried oxygen into every gap between the logs with the efficiency of a bellows operated by the storm itself. Mabel Dawson woke to the smell of smoke. She had been sleeping in the small apartment above the diner, the same apartment where she had lived for 20 years since Harold's death. The room that still contained his flannel shirts in the closet and his reading glasses on the nightstand, because removing them would have meant admitting that the last physical traces of a man she loved had no reason to remain in a world that had taken him from her. The smoke reached her before the sound of the fire did. She pulled on boots and a coat over her nightgown and descended the stairs to find the kitchen wall glowing orange through the window, the flames already climbing the exterior timber with the hungry speed of fire, fed by wind and dry wood, and the absolute indifference of elements that do not distinguish between a building and a life's work. She grabbed 3 things before she ran outside: her phone, a framed photograph of Harold that hung beside the kitchen door, and a small external hard drive that she had connected to the security camera system 2 nights earlier after saving the footage from the diner incident, the footage that showed Garrett Langford's boot connecting with Shadow's ribs and Colton Draper's calm response and Sheriff Granger's selective blindness. She had hidden the hard drive in a kitchen drawer after copying the files because Mabel Dawson had spent 20 years learning that evidence was only valuable if it survived the people who wanted it destroyed. Neighbors arrived within minutes. Bucket brigades formed in the snowmen and women passing water and shoveling dirt onto the flames with the desperate coordination of people fighting to save something that belonged to all of them. The fire did not consume the entire building, but it destroyed the kitchen and half of the dining room and left the rest soaked and smoke-damaged beyond immediate repair. Mabel stood in the parking lot in her nightgown and boots, the photograph pressed against her chest, the hard drive in her coat pocket, watching the steam rise from the ruined building into the storm. She did not cry. Her eyes were dry and hard, the eyes of a woman who had already lost the most important thing in her life 20 years ago, and understood that buildings could be rebuilt, but silence could not be taken back once a person decided to stop being silent. "You burned the wrong woman's house," she said to the flames. And although no one standing near her understood the full weight of the sentence, the words carried a finality that suggested something had shifted inside Mabel Dawson that would not shift back. She walked to the small white church on the edge of the town square and knocked on the door. Pastor Eli Merritt opened it in his bathrobe, his silver hair uncombed and his kind eyes blinking against the cold. Mabel placed the hard drive in his hands. "Keep this somewhere safe," she said. "Somewhere they will not think to look." Eli studied her face. He had known Mabel for 30 years. He had officiated at Harold's funeral. He had watched her carry a weight that he understood was heavier than grief, because grief at least has a name, but suspicion without proof is a burden that exists in silence. And silence is the heaviest thing a person can carry. He placed the hard drive in a wooden drawer beneath the altar without asking what was on it, because some things do not need to be explained to be understood. And a pastor who has spent 60 years listening to confessions learns to recognize the difference between a secret and a truth, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. Across town, Judd Oakes sat in his patrol car with the engine running and the heater blowing warm air against the windshield, where condensation fought a losing battle against the cold outside. His phone screen glowed in the dark interior, a text message. From the department scheduling system, the automated calendar that tracked shift assignments, meetings, and interdepartmental communications. But this message was not about scheduling. It was a forwarded calendar entry from Sheriff Granger's personal account, a meeting scheduled for the following morning at 5:30 on the Summit Pass Overlook. Attendees listed as LG and DL Langford. Judd stared at the message. His thumb hovered over the forward button. He thought about his mother, about his father's knees, about the mortgage on the house where he grew up, about the badge on his chest that had once meant something clean and simple, and now meant something complicated and stained and impossible to wear without feeling the weight of every compromise that had been made beneath its authority. Then he thought about the footage he had seen on his own phone, the deleted report, the edited witness statement, the casual efficiency with which a man's record had been falsified to protect another man's boot. He pressed forward. The recipient was a number he had obtained from Mabel Dawson earlier that evening. Colton Draper's phone. The message was brief. A time, a location, 2 sets of initials. He pressed send. And for the first time since joining the sheriff's department, Judd Oakes felt the badge on his chest lighten by a fraction, as though the metal itself understood that it had just been used for the purpose it was originally designed for. In the cabin at the edge of town, Colton Draper opened the photographs on Wren's phone and studied the file he had captured from Nolan Kemp's laptop. The water quality report was 12 pages long. It contained chemical analysis data from groundwater samples taken at 7 locations along the Pine Hollow Valley floor. The samples had been collected 14 months earlier by an environmental consulting firm hired by Langford Development as part of a routine land acquisition assessment. The report had never been filed with the state. It had never been shared with the county health department. It had been marked confidential and buried in the accounting files of a company whose primary business was supposed to be real estate development. The data showed elevated levels of industrial solvents in the groundwater at 5 of the 7 sample locations. The contamination pattern was consistent with runoff from the old mining and logging operations that had been conducted on Langford properties decades earlier. The concentrations exceeded EPA residential thresholds at 3 locations by margins that the report's own authors described as significant and requiring immediate remediation. Colton set the phone on the table. The water. Mabel's comment about the strange taste. The bottled water she used instead of the tap. The fact that Langford Development had been buying every parcel of land along the Valley Road for 3 years, not to build on it, but to control it, to own the ground above the poison, before anyone could test it to buy silence in the form of property deeds and construction jobs and monthly payments to a sheriff who asked no questions, because the answers would cost him everything. The dog, the kick, the arrest, the fire. None of it had ever been about a German shepherd in a diner. It had been about a secret buried in the water beneath an entire town. And Colton Draper, by stopping for coffee during a snowstorm on his way to keep a dead man's promise, had stumbled into the center of it. He looked at Wren. She had read the report over his shoulder, and her face carried the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the ground they have been standing on their entire life was poisoned, and that the people responsible knew about it and chose profit over the health of every person in the valley, including the family of the man who died on the ridge 20 years ago, and the brother who never came home from a war he did not start. It was never about Shadow, she said quietly. No, Colton replied, but Shadow is the reason we found it. His phone buzzed. The message from Judd. A time. A location. Summit Pass Overlook. 5:30 in the morning. Langford and Granger. Colton read it twice. Then he walked to the table where his jacket hung over a chair and reached into the inside pocket. He pulled out a small device, matte black, no larger than a thumb. A recording camera designed for covert field use, the kind issued to military working dog teams for documentation during operations in environments where written reports were insufficient and human witnesses were unreliable. He had carried it since leaving the service. He had never expected to use it again. He knelt beside Shadow, who sat watching him with amber eyes that reflected the dying firelight, and clipped the camera to the metal ring on the dog's collar with the practiced motion of hands that had performed this exact action dozens of times in places where the footage captured by a dog moving through hostile terrain was often the only evidence that survived. "One more mission," Colton said softly. Shadow's ears lifted. His body shifted forward. The subtle transformation of an animal transitioning from rest to readiness, from companion to operator. The switch that lived in the space between a handler's voice and a dog's understanding of what that voice was asking. Outside, the storm raged against the mountains. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned to coals that glowed like the last thoughts of a dying day. And in the darkness between the town and the ridge, the road to Summit Pass waited beneath the snow like a question that would be answered at dawn. The hours before dawn belong to the things a man has spent his life trying to outrun. Colton sat on the floor of the cabin with his back against the wall and his knees drawn toward his chest and his hands resting on his thighs with the palms pressed flat, the posture of someone trying to keep his body from shaking through the force of contact with something solid. The fire in the iron stove had died to a bed of coals that pulsed with a slow rhythm. Orange and then gray and then orange again, like the heartbeat of something too stubborn to stop but too exhausted to burn. Shadow lay beside him on the wooden floor, not sleeping, resting in the way that working dogs rest when they understand rest is temporary. Their bodies still, but their nervous systems humming at a frequency that most people would call tension, but that the dog simply called being alive. The flashback had been building since darkness fell. Now it arrived. Not the broad images he had learned to manage, not the dust or the sound of the wall or the color of the sky. This time it was one detail, just one. The weight of Sawyer's hand going slack inside his grip. The exact moment when holding someone became holding nothing. The way his own fingers kept pressing even after there was no pulse to find, because stopping meant admitting that the man beside him had become a body, and a body was something you carried rather than someone you saved. That was the detail that broke through every wall Colton had built. Not the explosion, not the blood, not the blue sky or the silent radio. Just the hand going slack, and the fingers that kept pressing because they did not know what else to do. Colton's hands curled into fists against his legs. The tremor was visible now, traveling from his fingers through his wrists with the persistence of a current that could not find ground. Shadow moved. Not dramatically. Not the way movies portray dogs responding to human grief. Shadow simply shifted his body 6 inches closer and placed his head on Colton's thigh. The weight of his skull settled against the muscle with a pressure that was firm enough to be real and gentle enough to be intentional. Amber eyes looked up. The tremor slowed. Not because the memory retreated. It never retreated. But because the weight of the dog's head on his leg existed in the present tense, a physical fact that competed with the memory for dominance and won, not by erasing the past, but by insisting that the present was also happening, and that the present contained warmth and weight and a heartbeat that was not fading. Colton placed his hand on Shadow's neck, felt the pulse beneath the fur. Steady, strong. "I could not save Sawyer," he whispered. The words were directed at the darkness and the coals and the dog and the ghost of a soldier who used his last breath to think about someone other than himself. "But I will not lose anyone else." Shadow's tail moved once against the floor, one slow sweep. A knock at the cabin door. Wren entered carrying a thermos and the particular energy of someone who had not slept either, but who had used the hours of insomnia for something more productive than memory. She sat across from Colton without asking him to stand or offering comfort that would have insulted both of them. "Tell me about him," she said. Colton looked at her. "Sawyer," something that was not in his letters. The question found a door in the wall that Colton had built around the memory. Not the door to the rooftop. A different door. One that led to the mess hall where Sawyer saved bread rolls to feed strays outside the wire. To the night patrol where he sang under his breath something country, always the same song. To the afternoon when Shadow was young and Sawyer sat on the ground and let the puppy chew his bootlaces for 20 minutes because he said, "A dog that trusts your boots trusts your soul." He was funny, Colton said. Nobody expects soldiers to be funny. But Sawyer could make an entire unit laugh during a briefing by raising one eyebrow. Wren smiled. Small, wet, 3 seconds. Real. He did that at home too. Drove our mother crazy. They sat in the quiet that followed. Not a heavy quiet. A quiet that had room for two people to share someone they had both loved. Then Mabel arrived. She came through the door with cold air and snow on her shoulders and the energy of a decision made during the night that she was not interested in discussing because the discussion had happened inside her own head and the verdict was final. "I will testify," she said, "about Harold, about the fire, about 20 years of watching this town sell itself to men who treat people the way they treat property." She sat at the table and placed both hands flat on the surface. "I spent 20 years being quiet because quiet felt safe. But safe and right are not the same word, and I am done pretending they are." She paused. Something shifted in her face. "My daughter lives in Ridgefield, 30 minutes east. She has been sick for 2 years. Stomach problems, headaches, fatigue the doctors cannot explain." Mabel's voice thinned. "She drinks well water. Same aquifer that feeds this valley." The sentence landed on the table with the weight of something that had been falling for a long time and had finally reached the ground. Colton showed her the photographs on Wren's phone, the water quality report, the chemical analysis. The EPA thresholds exceeded at 3 locations by margins described as significant. He explained what the data meant without softening it, because Mabel was not a woman who needed information wrapped in cushions before it could reach her. Mabel studied the screen. Her expression did not change, but her hands flat on the table, curled slowly closed. "They knew," she said. "They knew the water was poisoned, and they buried the report, and they bought the land so nobody else could test it." Yes, and Harold, the ridge, the logging expansion he was going to speak against. She raised her eyes. He was going to bring attention to that area, and they could not allow it. Colton did not answer because the question was not a question. It was a woman completing a pattern she had been staring at for 20 years, connecting the final point that made the shape visible. Judd Oakes arrived at the cabin 30 minutes before the planned operation. He came on foot, his personal vehicle parked a quarter-mile down the road to avoid tire tracks. He wore civilian clothes beneath a heavy coat, and the absence of his uniform had changed something in his posture, as though the badge and the department jacket had been compressing his spine for months, and their removal had allowed him to discover his actual height. "I contacted the FBI field office in Denver," he said. Anonymous encrypted email. Sent them the photographs of the altered incident report. Told them additional evidence of public corruption would be available at the Summit Pass Overlook at 05:30 this morning. He paused. "They are sending 2 vehicles from Denver. A state unit from the Colorado Bureau is meeting them on the highway. But they need direct evidence. The photographs open a file. They do not make arrests." Colton nodded. He understood the architecture of evidence the way he understood the architecture of hostile buildings. You could photograph a structure from outside and learn its shape, but you needed someone inside to map the rooms. The camera on Shadow's collar would go inside. If they discuss the payments, the fire, the dog, or the water, report the camera captures it. Audio and video. Time-stamped. Judd looked at Shadow, who sat beside Colton with the matte black camera already clipped to his collar, nearly invisible against the dark fur. And if they spot the dog, Shadow has crossed open terrain under fire. A parking lot in a snowstorm is not the worst thing he has done. Wren spoke from the table. "There is a ridge above the overlook. Tree cover on the north slope. Full visibility of the parking area without being seen from below." Colton looked at her. "You're staying in the truck." "I am going with you." "Wren?" "Sawyer would have gone." The name ended the argument. The Summit Pass Overlook occupied a wide shoulder of cleared ground on the eastern face of the mountain, a flat parking area built for tourists and truckers who wanted to look down at the valley from a height that made Pine Hollow seem small enough to hold in one hand. At 5:15, the overlook was empty and dark. The storm had thinned to scattered flurries that drifted through the pre-dawn gray like ash from a fire burning somewhere above the clouds. Wind pushed across the exposed ground, reshaping the snow constantly, so the terrain looked different every few seconds. Colton and Wren reached the tree line above the overlook at 5:22, climbing the north slope on foot along a buried hiking trail that Wren navigated by instinct. Shadow moved beside Colton in silence, the camera capturing the climb, the trees the overlook appearing below through gaps in the pines. At 5:29, headlights appeared on the highway. A black SUV rolled into the parking area. The engine stopped. Garrett Langford stepped out with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed every location existed for his convenience. His heavy coat hung open despite the cold. His dark hair was immaculate. Derek emerged from the passenger side in a leather jacket too thin for the temperature, lit a cigarette, and began pacing near the guardrail with the nervous energy of someone who processes anxiety through motion. 2 minutes later, a dark cruiser with no lights pulled in beside the SUV. Sheriff Lyle Granger climbed out slowly, his large frame stiff, and walked toward the others with the caution of a man who no longer trusted the ground beneath his own authority. "What is so urgent you needed me here before sunrise?" Granger said. "We need to settle the situation with the soldier," Garrett replied. Derek flicked ash into the snow. The diner fire did not scare him off. "He is still running around with that dog." Granger frowned. "You told me the fire was handled." "It was handled. The man is still here." Colton gave Shadow the signal. Open palm, fingers extended, slow downward motion. Shadow went. He descended the slope with the fluid silence of an animal whose body had been built and trained for exactly this purpose, moving through hostile terrain without disturbing the air. His paws barely broke the snow crust. His dark coat merged with the shadows between drifts. The camera recorded everything. Garrett's voice carried clearly in the still air. They will forget about the soldier once the dog is gone. No dog, no proof. Granger shifted. You told me that was already done. It should have been. You assured us the paperwork would close the incident. I arrested the man. If this comes back to my department— It will not, Garrett interrupted. You keep your position. Our project still needs a cooperative sheriff. The words were captured, recorded, time-stamped. Derek voice careless and loud. The diner fire did not work either. The old woman is tougher than expected. Granger's head turned sharply. You told me that was an electrical fire from the storm. Garrett shrugged. The silence that followed was the sound of the last excuse Lyle Granger had built for himself collapsing under its own weight. Accepting money was one category of failure. Learning that the men who paid you had committed arson in the town you swore to protect was another category entirely. The category where denial stops being strategy and becomes confession. Then Derek turned toward the guardrail. He had been reaching for another cigarette when his hand stopped. His eyes caught movement at the edge of the parking lot where the snow shifted in a pattern that did not match the wind. A dark shape, low, moving. Shadow. What the hell? Derek's voice cracked. That dog is supposed to be gone. His hand went to the pistol beneath his jacket. The gunshot cracked across the mountains and echoed off the ridge walls and sent birds scattering from the pines in a dark eruption of wings. Snow exploded 2 feet from Shadow as the bullet struck frozen ground and ricocheted off the guardrail with a metallic ring. Shadow reacted before the echo faded. His body shifted into the evasive zigzag drilled into him through years of combat. K9 training driving sideways and forward in unpredictable angles that no panicked hand could follow. Derek fired again. Wide. The bullet punched a hole in a snowdrift. Colton was already descending. He came down the slope with controlled speed boots, carving a path through the snow gravity and training combining to cover distance in seconds that felt like minutes. Wren followed. Halfway down her right boot, hit a patch of ice hidden beneath powder, and her balance shifted violently toward a narrow crevice where wind had carved a deep crack along the rock face at the overlook's edge. Shadow saw it before anyone else did. The German shepherd broke from his evasive pattern and lunged toward the sound of Wren's stumble, barking with sharp, commanding authority that pulled Derek's aim away from the ridge and toward the dog. 2 seconds of distraction. Exactly the time Colton needed to reach Wren's arm and pull her back onto solid ground. In those 2 seconds, Derek fired a third time. The bullet grazed Shadow's left shoulder. The fur parted. A thin red line opened against the black and tan coat. Shadow flinched a shudder passing through his frame, but his stride did not break, because the dog had been conditioned to continue after contact with hostile fire, and a graze wound did not meet the threshold his training recognized as a reason to stop. Colton reached Derek in the parking lot. A strike to the wrist sent the pistol across the snow. A rotation of the arm converted momentum into descent. Derek hit the frozen ground face first with his arm locked behind him. Garrett stood beside his SUV. He did not run. He did not raise his hands. He stood with the stillness of a man discovering in real time that consequences were not something that only happened to people who could not afford lawyers. Granger stood beside his cruiser with his hand on his holstered weapon, but without the will to draw it. His expression was not anger. It was the face of a man watching water rise above a wall he had built from paper. Then the engines came. 2 black SUVs on the highway, federal insignia reflecting the first light of dawn. Behind them, a state investigation vehicle, blue and red lights igniting the snow in alternating bursts. Doors opened. Officers in tactical jackets stepped out with organized efficiency. Among them walked Judd Oakes in his deputy uniform. His badge caught the light from the federal vehicles and reflected it in alternating colors, red and then blue, as though the metal was deciding which version of itself it wanted to be. Derek was already disarmed and prone on the ground. Garrett watched the agents approach with a face drained of color. A 30-year-old heir standing in a parking lot at dawn, discovering that the future he had purchased was being taken back. Granger lowered his head as the handcuffs closed around his wrists and said nothing, the posture of a man who had known this was coming and had spent 2 years hoping it would arrive after he was no longer alive to stand in the snow and feel the metal on his skin. Shadow sat beside Colton in the center of the parking lot. The camera on his collar blinked. Blood seeped from the graze on his shoulder, a thin line that the cold was already slowing. His amber eyes watched the scene with quiet focus, the gaze of an animal who understood his mission was complete, but who would not stand down until his handler's hand told him it was finished. Wren knelt beside the dog. Her fingers found the wound and pressed gently against the surrounding fur, steady, despite the cold and the adrenaline and the tears that moved down her face without sound. Colton placed his hand on her shoulder. He will be all right. He has survived worse. The words were true, but his voice carried a tremor that Wren understood without needing it explained. The first light of morning reached the ridge above Summit Pass. The sky shifted from charcoal to the color of old silver. Through the thinning snow, Pine Hollow became visible in the valley below. The rooftops, the roads, the frozen river, the blackened remains of Summit Diner. The small white church, where a hard drive waited in a drawer beneath an altar. A chain of evidence that stretched from a diner security camera to a dog's collar camera to the recorded words of 3 men now standing in handcuffs on a mountain overlook, while the sun rose behind them and the valley they had tried to own watched from below. Shadow's tail moved once against the frozen ground. One slow sweep. Colton placed his hand on the dog's head and held it there, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. The pulse beneath the warmth, the life beneath the pulse. And he understood that sometimes the distance between losing everything and keeping everything is not measured in strategy or strength, but in the willingness of one living creature to walk into danger for another without being asked and without expecting anything in return except the right to walk beside them again when the danger is over. In the days that followed the arrests on Summit Pass, Pine Hollow changed the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window that has been painted shut for years. The fresh air did not arrive gently. It came with the force of accumulated pressure, and the town breathed it in with the desperate relief of people who had not realized how stale the atmosphere had become until clean air reminded them what breathing was supposed to feel like. Federal vehicles appeared on roads that had known nothing but logging trucks and school buses for decades. Investigators in dark jackets walked the streets with clipboards and cameras, photographing the burned shell of Summit Diner, the abandoned lumber yard where Shadow had been caged, the development office at the Pine Hollow Lodge, where Garrett Langford had conducted business, as though the town existed solely to be reshaped according to his specifications. Neighbors who had spent 3 years avoiding eye contact when the Langford name was mentioned now stood in small groups outside the post office and the grocery store, speaking in voices that grew louder each day as the silence that had protected the powerful began to dissolve like snow beneath a sun that refused to stop shining. Garrett and Derek Langford were transported to the federal detention facility in Denver on the 3rd morning. They traveled in separate vehicles because the marshals understood that proximity between co-defendants produced conversations that complicated prosecutions, and because the cousins had already begun the quiet internal arithmetic of calculating which one would offer testimony against the other first. Garrett rode with his wrists cuffed and his posture rigid, and his face arranged in the composed expression of a man who believed his legal team would resolve the inconvenience within days. He had placed 3 calls from the Pine Hollow holding cell before the transfer, each to a different attorney, each conducted in the precise tone of someone ordering corrections to a filing error, rather than defending himself against 14 pages of federal charges. Derek rode with his forehead against the window and his eyes unfocused and his hands motionless in his lap. He had not spoken since the overlook. The confidence that had fueled his behavior in the diner, the smirk and the camera phone, and the casual violence of kicking a dog because doing so seemed entertaining, had drained from him completely. What remained was the hollow stillness of a young man discovering that the distance between cruelty performed for amusement and consequences delivered by the federal government was far shorter than the privilege of his upbringing had led him to believe. The charges filled 14 pages: conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery of a public official, arson in the first degree, animal cruelty, willful concealment of environmental contamination data from state and federal regulatory agencies. The evidence came from 4 sources that together formed a chain strong enough to hold the weight of everything the Langford family had spent 3 years trying to bury. Mabel Dawson's security camera footage preserved on the hard drive she had carried from the burning diner and entrusted to Pastor Eli Merritt. The photographs Colton captured from Nolan Kemp's laptop during the warehouse extraction. The collar camera recording from Shadow, documenting every word spoken on Summit Pass. And the testimony of Deputy Judson Oakes regarding the systematic falsification of official records by Sheriff Lyle Granger. Granger was charged separately and held in the county facility rather than transferred to Denver, a distinction whose cruelty lay in its geography. He would spend his pre-trial weeks in the building where he had worked for 30 years, walking corridors where deputies who once sought his approval now maintained the careful blankness of people who had not decided whether they felt betrayal or pity toward a man who had converted his oath into a commodity and sold it at a price that turned out to be far lower than he imagined. Nolan Kemp requested a meeting with federal investigators on the second day. The accountant sat in an interview room with fluorescent light reflecting off his round glasses and his thin hands wrapped around a paper cup of water that served more as an anchor than a beverage, and he talked for 4 hours without interruption. He described the financial structure of the payments to Granger monthly transfers routed through a shell company that existed only as a line on a registration document. He outlined the land acquisition timeline, the strategic purchase of every parcel above the contaminated aquifer designed to prevent independent testing before Langford Development could secure the contracts that would make the contamination someone else's legal responsibility. He recounted the meetings where Garrett reviewed the water quality report and decided that filing it with state regulators would cost more than burying it. He described the call in which Garrett ordered Shadow destroyed. He described the call in which Garrett ordered the diner burned. He described both with the flat exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years carrying numbers that added up to crimes and who had reached the point where the weight of pretending they were merely accounting had exceeded his capacity for self-deception. The federal attorney closed her notebook when Nolan finished and told him his cooperation would be reflected in the record. Nolan nodded once with the slow exhalation of someone setting down a burden he had been holding so long his arms had forgotten what empty hands felt like. State environmental investigators arrived on the 5th day. They came with drilling equipment and sampling kits and the methodical patience of scientists who understood that the truth about water contamination lived not in testimony or financial records, but in the molecular composition of the liquid that every person in the valley drank every day without thinking about what it contained. They established monitoring wells at 9 locations across the valley floor. They collected samples from private wells, municipal supply lines, the river, and the groundwater itself. The process took 6 days, during which the investigators became a visible presence in a town that had spent 3 years being assured that the faint taste in its water was nothing to worry about. The results confirmed what the Langford report had documented 14 months earlier. Industrial solvents from decades of mining and logging operations on Langford properties had migrated into the groundwater at concentrations exceeding federal residential safety thresholds at 5 of 9 test sites. The contamination was not dramatic. It would not produce headlines featuring hazmat suits and evacuation orders. It was the quiet kind, the patient kind that works through years of daily exposure, producing fatigue and headaches and digestive problems that doctors attribute to aging or stress, because no one has tested the water and no one has tested the water. Because the people who knew it needed testing paid generously to ensure the question never arose. The state issued a remediation order. Langford Development was designated financially responsible. The cleanup would span years and cost millions drawn from frozen family assets, and the irony that money accumulated through silence would now be spent repairing the damage that silence had enabled was not lost on anyone in the valley who had been paying attention. On the 9th day, the federal attorney called Colton Draper and asked him to testify at the preliminary hearing. Colton sat in the cabin with the phone on the table and Shadow at his feet, and the weight of the request settling over him like a second gravity. Shadow's shoulder was healing beneath a clean bandage, the graze wound closing under the care of a Ridgefield veterinarian who had examined the dog and told Colton that Shadow was lucky, then corrected herself and said that luck in her experience usually meant the animal had been trained by someone who gave a damn. Testifying meant standing in a public room and stating his name and his rank and explaining why he was in Pine Hollow. It meant speaking about Sawyer Calloway in front of strangers who had never been on a rooftop in a foreign city and could not understand what it cost to open that door while court reporters typed every word into a record that would outlast everyone present. He could decline. The attorney was clear about that. The evidence was sufficient without him. The case would proceed on camera footage and financial records and Kemp's cooperation and Judd's testimony about the falsified reports. He could remain invisible, leave Pine Hollow the way he arrived, a veteran passing through a town on his way to a cemetery, unknown and unremembered. He sat with that option until Shadow placed his chin on Colton's knee and looked up at him with amber eyes that carried the patient clarity of an animal who had walked into an open parking lot under gunfire because the mission required it, and because hiding was not something his training or his character permitted when the stakes were high enough. "You did not hide," Colton said quietly. "You walked out there and let them see you." Shadow's ears tilted forward. Colton picked up the phone and told the attorney he would be there. The hearing convened in a temporary courtroom in the Ridgefield County building. Colton wore civilian clothes, a dark shirt and trousers purchased by Wren from a shop in town, because his only clothing was the Navy uniform he had worn like armor for 5 years. And he had decided that armor belonged to a version of himself that no longer required protection from the act of being known. He stated his name, his service record. He described arriving in Pine Hollow and stopping at Summit Diner and the sequence of events that followed. Then the attorney asked why he stayed when the sheriff told him to leave. Colton was silent for several seconds. The courtroom waited. Because my dog was taken by people who planned to destroy him to protect a secret they were hiding from this entire town. And because 5 years ago I made a promise to a dying soldier that I would visit Pine Hollow and look after the people he loved. His voice was steady. Sawyer Calloway was 26 years old. He was an infantryman who wrote letters home about stray dogs because he believed how a person treats animals reveals who they really are. He died on a rooftop overseas when a wall collapsed on our position. I held him while he bled. The last thing he said was to visit his hometown and tell his sister he was not afraid. He looked at the room. It took me 5 years to get here. I will carry that delay for the rest of my life. But I am here now. And what I found was a town whose water was being poisoned by the same people who tried to make my dog disappear, the same people who burned an old woman's diner because she had the courage to save evidence they wanted destroyed. In the gallery, Wren sat with the Calloway jaw set firm and tears moving silently down her cheeks, the kind a person does not wipe, because wiping would diminish something that deserved its full expression. Mabel testified next. She walked to the witness chair with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for a conversation she did not know she was going to have until a soldier and a dog walked into her diner during a snowstorm and changed the direction of everything. She told them about Harold, the ridge, the cable that snapped the week after he announced his opposition to the logging expansion. 20 years of silence chosen not because she believed it was right, but because she could not survive the alternative. And the cost of that silence discovered only when a buried water report explained why her daughter in Ridgefield had been ill for 2 years, with symptoms no physician could diagnose, because no physician thought to test the water. She told them about the fire, the smell of smoke that woke her, the 3 objects she grabbed before running into the snow, the hard drive containing footage that proved what happened on the night the Langford heir kicked a German shepherd and a Navy SEAL stood up and a sheriff chose the wrong side of his own badge. Judd Oakes testified last. He described the altered incident report, the deleted witness statement, the edit metadata, linking the changes to Granger's login. He described a department culture built on quiet compliance, on the unspoken understanding that certain names existed above investigation. He did not apologize for the time it took him to act, but the weight of the delay was present in every measured sentence. The testimony of a young man who understood that doing the right thing late does not erase the months of doing nothing, but who also understood that late was infinitely better than never. The judge ruled sufficient evidence existed to proceed. Bail for Garrett Langford was denied. Spring returned to Pine Hollow in stages each one, an act of faith performed by a valley that had spent months buried under the weight of snow and secrets, and was now testing cautiously whether warmth could be trusted to last. First came water. Snowmelt trickling from the ridges into creek beds, silent since November, filling the valley with quiet music that changed the air from the dead hush of winter to the living hush of a world in motion. Then came light, the sun clearing the ridge earlier each week until mornings arrived in gold instead of gray, and the shadows pulled back from the town like something that had overstayed and finally understood it was time to go. Where Summit Diner had stood, a new building rose from the foundation up. The frame went up in March, raised by local volunteers working alongside a Ridgefield construction crew that Mabel hired with insurance money. and a small business loan co-signed by 11 Pine Hollow residents who appeared at the bank on the same Tuesday without coordinating because small towns speak through action, and 11 signatures was the town's way of saying what no speech could carry. The building was larger than the original. Fresh timber. Wide windows facing the highway and Summit Pass. A modern kitchen. A water filtration system connected to the clean municipal supply established by the State Remediation Project. Above the front door, a hand-painted wooden sign in dark green letters against cream. Warm food, clean truth. Mabel opened the diner on a morning in late March, when the sun was strong enough to warm the parking lot, and the air smelled of pine and thawed earth and possibility. She wore a clean apron and her silver bun, and the face that had greeted strangers and neighbors for 20 years, but something behind that face had changed. The lines were the same. The sharpness was the same. But the weight had shifted, redistributed from the place where she had carried silence into the place where she now carried the knowledge that her silence was over, and that the truth she had protected in a kitchen drawer and a church altar had survived the fire and the men who set it. She poured coffee for truckers who entered through the new door with the tentative happiness of people returning to a place they feared was gone. For a young family from Denver who discovered the diner online and would learn its history from the newspaper article framed beside the register. For Judd Oakes, who came in uniform and sat at the counter and ordered eggs and did not look at his phone once during the entire meal. Across the valley on the slope beside the rebuilt rescue shelter, a training field stretched across ground that had been cleared and planted with grass now showing the first green of new growth. A sign at the entrance read, Veterans and K-9 Healing Program, and beneath it, founded by Colton Draper and Ren Calloway, in memory of Sawyer Calloway, United States Army. 3 rescued dogs worked with 3 veterans from the Ridgefield VA Center on the field, their movements tentative and imperfect in the way all beginnings are the awkward first steps of relationships that would eventually become the steadiest thing in these men's lives. A counselor at the VA had referred them after hearing about the program through Judd, who heard about it from Mabel, who suggested it to Colton over coffee in the unfinished diner while carpenters hammered overhead and Shadow slept against his boot. Colton stood at the fence watching. Shadow sat beside his knee muzzle, silvered with age posture, still proud amber eyes observing the younger dogs with the patient authority of an animal who understood that leadership meant showing others how to be calm when calm was difficult. The younger dogs looked toward him between exercises, orienting themselves the way students orient toward a standard they have not yet reached, but intend to. Ren moved among the veterans with steady hands and a patient voice demonstrating techniques learned from Colton and softened by her own instinct for gentleness. She had changed since winter. The change was quiet, visible not in dramatic transformation, but in the way she stood, which was taller, and the way she spoke about Sawyer, which was more frequently and with less grief. And the way she looked across the field at Colton, with something in her expression that she had not carried for 5 years, the tentative belief that moving forward did not require leaving the past behind, but rather learning to carry it differently. On a Tuesday in April, they drove to the military cemetery in Ridgefield. The road over Summit Pass was clear snow retreated to the highest ridges where it would hold until summer. The valley was green beneath a sky so blue it seemed to be compensating for every gray day of the winter that preceded it. The cemetery occupied a hillside above town. White stones in rows identical in dimension because the military does not rank grief by the stars on a uniform. Sawyer Calloway's headstone stood in the 4th row. Clean marble, sharp letters. A name that winter had not eroded because stone does not forget what has been carved into it, regardless of how many storms pass over its face. Colton stood before the stone for a long time. Shadow sat beside his left leg wearing a new collar tag that read, "Working Dog Retired," because Shadow's operational life was finished and his remaining years belonged to the training field and the cabin porch, and all the quiet places earned by a dog who spent his youth in the loudest ones. Wren held wildflowers from the meadow below the shelter, purple and yellow, already softening in the spring air, but vivid against the white marble. Colton removed a unit insignia pin from his jacket pocket, the small metal emblem of the team he and Sawyer served on, in a place he could now name in his mind without hearing walls collapse. He placed it on top of the headstone. It clicked against the marble, a small sound that was the quietest thing in the cemetery and the most significant. "I made it, Sawyer. 5 years late. I am sorry about that." Wind moved through the grass. Pine resin from the ridge. The distant sound of water in a creek below the hillside. "Your sister knows you were not afraid. She knew before I told her. But she needed to hear it from someone who was there, and I needed to be the one who said it." He paused. "We built something in Pine Hollow. Dogs and veterans learning to trust again. I think you would understand it better than anyone. Your sister runs it with me. She has your jaw and your stubbornness, and she is the best person I have met since losing you." He looked down at Shadow. "And this one is still the finest soldier I have ever served beside." Wren knelt and placed the flowers at the base of the stone. Her fingers rested against the marble, and her eyes closed, and whatever she said to her brother in that silence was hers alone. A conversation conducted in the private language that exists between siblings, separated by death, and sustained by the particular loyalty that does not require proximity to remain unbroken. They drove back in the late afternoon through amber light that turned the valley into something from a painting, the hillsides glowing as though the earth remembered warmth and was expressing gratitude for its return. Colton parked outside the diner. Mabel was closing up, wiping tables with the efficiency of repetition, the motions of a woman who found meaning in routine, because routine was proof that the world continued, and that continuing was itself a form of victory. She looked up. "How was the drive?" "Clear." She studied his face with 30 years of practice at reading what people carry behind their expressions. "You look different," she said. "How?" "Like a man who decided to set something down and discovered his arms still worked." She poured coffee without being asked, set the cup on the counter. Then she spoke with the quiet deliberation of someone who had been waiting for the right temperature to plant a seed she had been holding all winter. "I stopped trying to understand God's plan the day Harold died. I do not pretend to know why some people are taken early and others are left to carry the weight of their absence for decades. But I have lived 62 years in this valley, and I have learned one thing I believe to be true." She folded the dish rag and placed it on the counter beside the register. God does not send thunder. He sends people. They arrive late sometimes. They arrive during storms. They arrive carrying wounds so deep they do not believe they have anything left to give. But they arrive. And arriving, Mr. Draper, is where every miracle I have ever witnessed began. Not with perfection, not with readiness. Just with a person who showed up when showing up was the hardest thing they could have done. Colton lifted the mug. "You showed up too, Mabel. 20 years of showing up. Every morning. Every cup of coffee. Every time you saved that footage or refused to forget what happened to Harold. That is not stubbornness. That is faith." Mabel smiled. The smile of a woman who had rebuilt a diner and a silence and a life from ashes set by men who learned that some things do not stay burned no matter how much accelerant you pour on them. That evening, Colton sat on the cabin porch with Shadow beside him. The dog's head rested on his paws, amber eyes half open, watching the valley with the calm attention of an animal who had nothing left to guard, but who watched because watching was woven into every fiber of what he was. The sun descended behind the western ridge, pulling long gold bands across the valley floor. Pine Hollow looked different in this light, warmer, smaller, real. The kind of place a person might remain in, not because it was perfect, but because it had proven itself willing to fight for its own truth, and a town that fights for truth is a town worth defending and a town worth calling home. Colton realized he did not want to leave. Every place since the rooftop had been temporary. Every town a name forgotten within a week. He moved through the world the way weather moves through a valley, touching everything and settling nowhere, because settling meant building. And building meant caring, and caring meant risking the loss that he already knew was the price the world charged for attachment. Pine Hollow had changed that equation. Not because the mountains were more beautiful or the people more kind. It changed because Colton did something here he had not done in 5 years. He stayed when leaving was easier. He spoke the name he had locked away. He allowed himself to be seen, and the world held. Shadow pressed his shoulder against Colton's leg. The pressure that had meant the same thing for 4 years, across 2 continents, and through every dark night they had shared. I am here. I am not leaving. Whatever comes next, we walk into it together. Colton placed his hand on the dog's head and felt the warmth beneath the fur, and the pulse beneath the warmth, and the life beneath the pulse. And he sat on the porch of a cabin in a town he had come to by accident and stayed in by choice, and watched the last of the light climb the eastern ridge and disappear into a sky turning from gold to violet, to the deep, still blue of a spring evening in the mountains. Below in the valley, Mabel switched off the last light in the diner and locked the door and walked home through streets that had learned to breathe again. On a hillside above Ridgefield, a unit pin rested on white marble beside wildflowers opening in the evening air, their petals holding the final light as though they meant to carry it through the coming dark and give it back to the morning when the sun returned and the valley woke and the world did what the world has always done after the longest winters and the deepest silences and the hardest truths. It began again.